Even though Russell Moccasins has been making moccasins for over 125 years, moccasins have been a part of the American story well before there was even the United States. Native Americans had been making and wearing moccasins for potentially hundreds and hundreds of years before the United States was even established. And the origin of the word moccasin comes from the French author and traveler Marc Lescarbot, who traveled to the French colony of Acadia in 1606, where he first saw Native Americans wearing moccasins. And the really interesting thing about this is there was tons of different tribes of Native Americans who wore moccasins, but they all called them different things with slightly different ways of constructing and making the moccasins. So when was Russell Moccasins founded? Well, in 1898, William C. Russell acquired the Wright Shoe Company, which was a logging boot company that went out of business, and William initially started making the welted and stitched down boots that the Wright Shoe Company was known for making, but they really started to find their spot in their market when they added the true American moccasin construction to their lineup, and it was immediately picked up by hunters, outdoorsmen, sportsmen, because of the unique properties and qualities you can really only get from this style of construction. And that's when William Russell founded W.C. Russell Moccasin Company. And to show you how small the footwear industry was back in the early 1900s, in 1901, a Russell employee, John Adreski, moved to Chippewa Falls and started the Chippewa Boot Company. But this classic American construction wasn't without its flaws, and in 1910, Russell developed an overlapping seam for the moccasin construction that received a U.S. patent under W.C. Russell Moccasin Company, because it's very subtle, but it makes a big difference. And I'll show you exactly what that is later when we get to the construction part. But unfortunately, in 1926, William Russell's health was on the decline, and the Bass brothers of G.H. Bass Co. in Maine purchased W.C. Russell moccasins. And just a year later, in 1927, when the Spirit of St. Louis touched down in Paris after completing the very first transatlantic flight, Charles Lindbergh was wearing a pair of Russell moccasins. Then just a year later, Bill Guston, former manager of Russell Moccasins, bought the company back and introduced new styles, including the Bird Shooter, which is this boot, and sold Russells both directly via catalog and through outfitters like Abercrombie & Fitch, which, pretty cool. Right there, you have a little tag that says VL&A, which was later bought by Abercrombie & Fitch, so technically this is an Abercrombie & Fitch boot in an interesting way. But by 1930, the Great Depression was in full swing and made sales drop off by 2/3 and nearly completely killed off Russell moccasins until a giant order came in from Sears and Roebuck, helping the company stay afloat during those really tough times. Then during World War II, the US War Department contracted Russell to produce boots for the Army. In addition, they made soft-soled Oneida moccasins that were specially ordered for blimps. Then another really interesting connection to history. In 1947, Earl Schaefer was the first person to complete the Appalachian Trail, and he did it in a pair of Russell moccasins. This era saw a huge explosion in mock toe boots being worn by hunters and hikers and outdoorsmen, and led to the creation of other notable mock toe style boots with the creation of the Red Wing Classic 877 mock toe in 1952. Then in 1960, Bill Guston made a decision to move the company direct to consumer and away from the dealership model, and by just a decade later, because of those business model changes, 50% of their business was direct to consumer with the help of those mail catalogs. And then unfortunately in the 1980s, a decline in Bill Guston's health resulted in Ralph, his son-in-law, taking over leadership of the company. And in the 90s, Joe Gagno, the current COO and co-owner, began working for Russell. And the cool thing is Joe's grandfather was one of the early shoemakers at Russell. Just another example of how everything is so connected and how small this company is, but how impactful it is for so many people. Then if we fast forward all the way to 2022, Russell Moccasins was really struggling following the COVID crisis, and a change was needed in order to keep Russell alive. And that's when Luke Colby, whose family had been wearing Russells for 4 generations, and his associates stepped in and offered to buy Russell moccasins. And with the full support and blessing of the owning family, Russell lived to see another generation, and over the last year and a half, Luke and company have been rebuilding the workforce and procedures, cut the lead times from 15 months to having a range of in-stock models, and their premier builds are being produced in 8 to 12 weeks, and they're currently moving to a new facility with even more space for expansion and training and growing the business, with the goal of the company remaining very specialized in the outdoor and sportsman market, because that's a huge part of the reason why Russell survived for 125 years, and also expanding into more casual stuff for everyday wear as more and more people find and see the value in this style of construction, including some really notable people over the years like President Coolidge, President Eisenhower, President George W. Bush, General Jimmy Doolittle, General Norman Schwarzkopf, Prince of Wales, Harrison Ford, Robert Redford, Matt Damon, Tom Selleck, Larry Hagman, John Wayne, Charles Lindbergh that we talked about, Wiley Post, and Earl Schaefer. And that just goes to show you how notable and how intertwined Russell moccasins have been in United States history. And that to me is arguably the most American boot technique of all time. And thanks to Ridge for sponsoring this video. You might know Ridge from the wallets they make. They make aluminum, really compact, minimalist wallets, have different materials like carbon fiber. They finally just broke into the luggage world with these German Macrolin polycarbonate shell luggage. So it's not your soft luggage. So you don't have to worry about all your stuff getting overly squished, and they just look cool. This color's cool, right? But look at this color. This is the color I want. Because there's no mistake in this bag at the airport when you're at luggage claim and you're trying to find your bag. It can be pretty obvious when this one comes through. And on the inside, you've got nice separation. You've got a few different layers on the inside, some different stuff you can move around to make sure all your stuff's not just jumbled up together. You can actually separate it and keep it straight, which is something I really like about their little travel backpack. The thing that's nice about this is we've got an extra zipper here at the front that you can undo the entire front part and open it up like this. So if you got your camera gear, you got all your stuff separated, got all your electronics up here in all these individual pockets. But the thing that makes it really nice, it's got these little separators. There's Velcro on the inside, so you can keep everything separated. So if you want to just grab the top stuff, you undo this zipper. If you want access to all of it, lay flat, you'll undo this zipper that has even more little compartments. So I like the fact that they're using high quality materials with the ballistic nylon, the polycarbonate shell, the high quality water resistant zippers, the fiddle lock magnetic chest strap. So if you're in the market for some new luggage, be sure to check out Ridge via link in my description. And thanks again to Ridge for sponsoring this video. So what is it about this boot that makes it so unique and this construction that people are willing to pay a premium for? And how did this boot almost go extinct? Well, first, what is this boot? Well, the brand is Russell Moccasins. The style is the bird shooter from somewhere between 1930 and 1935. They weigh 2 pounds. The price of a modern version of this is $775. They're made in the United States, and if you want a pair of these, check them out via link in my description. One of the biggest testaments to this boot is the leather itself, because this leather is obviously very old. It's almost 100 years old. You can see it's kind of splitting and cracking in a few areas, but for being nearly 100 years old, it's still in really, really good condition. Partially because they probably were well taken care of, but that's only made possible by the leather choice that Russell has historically made. Because to keep these boots as water resistant as possible for hunting, and to make the lasting process that we'll go over later, which is ridiculous, to make that easier, they use a really soft and saturated leather. It's completely packed with oils and conditioners, so that even on a long, wet day out in the dewy fields fowl hunting, this leather's not gonna absorb all that water and crack up and split in a few months. And the craziest thing of all this is after 100 years, or nearly 100 years, this leather still has pull-up. You can still see there's plenty of conditioning and oil inside this leather keeping it alive. Whereas modern foam boots, if you leave them in a closet for 5 years, they literally crumble without even touching them. And we've cut apart plenty of historical boots, and this is by far the best conditioned leather that we've seen in any of those boots. And it's 2.3 millimeters thick, right in that boot thickness you want. And you could still wear these today if we weren't cutting them in half, obviously. But what about the lining? Well, interestingly, there's really no lining at all, not even in the vamp. And they do make a double vamp version historically and today, but the simplicity I think is a big part of why sportsmen and hunters love them so much, because they weren't overly complicated. They were really flexible, breathable, and light. And because of the way that they're made and the leather that they used, there wasn't really a need for an additional layer on the inside because of how water resistant they were. And really the only part that is lined is right here in the internal counter area. It just gives you an extra piece of leather to reinforce that area that gets worn down from a lot of heel slip. And speaking of how these are built and the construction of them, the way that these are built is the really interesting part of these, and part of what made them the boot of choice for outdoorsmen for so long, and why they feel unlike any other boot that I've ever worn. And I've worn hundreds and hundreds of boots for this channel. So what makes this boot so different? Well, it's the moccasin construction, because most boots start with an upper that's sewn together and it's wrapped around the boot last, which is the shape of a foot, and then tacked to the bottom of the last to create that boot shape. And that's how 99.9% of boots are made. It's the most common way of making boots. Moccasin construction, on the other hand, is the exact opposite. They start at the bottom of the boot and wrap a piece of leather up around the side of the boot last, and then tack it into place painstakingly with nails to get that two-dimensional flat sheet of leather to create a three-dimensional shape. And then once it's tacked into place, they take that U-shaped piece of leather here and they hand sew that sidewall piece to the top piece, binding all those layers together. And this seam right here, this hand sewn sewn bit is that patented part that we talked about in the history, where most moccasins that you see, they're just two pieces of leather that butt up together, and that seam sews those two layers together. This patented Russell moccasin technique, it still butts up in the same way, but this top U-shaped piece wraps all the way up and around, encapsulating that sidewall piece, and then it's sewn together. And what this did is made them even more water resistant, it made them more durable, and it gave it the Russell moccasin unique look. So then why aren't all boots made this way? If they're superior and they're more comfortable in the sidewall, all these things, well, because it's extremely labor intensive and it's extremely skill intensive. Because you can't just get someone off the street and in a couple weeks train them how to make this style of boot. It takes years of experience and expertise and training. And as far as I understand, there's no machines that are able to do it. But that's just the moccasin part. The midsole is where this boot really starts to get interesting, because traditional moccasins, usually you don't have an outsole or a midsole, you're usually just standing on the moccasin itself. But in the early days of boot making and moccasin making, people started fusing the European style of boot making with this Native American style of boot making by taking the moccasin construction upper and sewing it to a more European style bottom of a boot with the midsole and outsole. And the way they did that was basically just sewing it together, because on the inside, this moccasin has 2 rows of Blake stitching that sews the moccasin down to the midsole. And you might be thinking, oh, I see stitches right there. That must be the Blake stitch. That's not the Blake stitch. You can't even see the Blake stitch from the outside. What that stitch is that structural stitch that sews the midsole down to the outsole. So you've got the moccasin sewn to the midsole, and then the midsole sewn to the outsole. It's about as simple and flat of a construction as there is in footwear. But that might not have made any sense at all. So let's cut these in half, and I'll show you not just how they're constructed different from a Goodyear welt or a stitched down boot, but I'm going to show you why I think not only this anatomical foot shape was so comfortable for people, but how this moccasin sidewall and this lasting from the bottom up makes these boots feel completely different than any other boot. All right, this was a painful one because these are my perfect size. They're like a nice anatomical shape and they're old, cool, historical boots, but we got them cut in half, so let's see what's inside. Maybe. So now you can really see how this U-shaped piece that Russell patented in the 40s really works. This top piece wraps up around and is sewn together. You can also see how the 2 Blake stitch lines wrap all the way around the inside of the boot, and how this midsole is sewn to the outsole. But the craziest and maybe biggest surprise to me is this part underneath the heel, because they use a huge slab of leather under the heel that I assume acts like the shank to give it more support and stability while covering the gap caused by that leather that's wrapped underneath, creating that moccasin construction. And even that gap is filled in with cork. And you can even see how thick the leather counter is. So this boot is way beefier than I expected it to be. I thought for sure it was gonna be a really simple construction. Now that it's cut in half, you can understand why they were so durable and made it through the entire Appalachian Trail, because there's just fewer fail points compared to modern boots and all these seams and synthetic materials. It's about as simple of a boot as you can make while still being supportive and durable. But that's not necessarily why I think they feel so different and why they're still arguably some of the most comfortable boots you can buy. The reason is that sidewall right there. Now that we have it opened up, you can see how this true moccasin construction creates a completely seamless transition from the bottom of your foot to that sidewall that hugs your foot. Compare that to a Goodyear welt that has an insole where the upper is sewn to the insole. It creates a hard transition. Even stitch down boots with or without an insole still have that hard transition. This is that smooth, perfect transition without any extra layers or any extra stitchings or lips or transitions. And so the beauty of that is this being such an anatomical wide last and being such soft, supple leather, they perfectly shape to the shape of your foot, almost like you put on a leather sock. And all that combined is why these boots feel completely different than basically any other boots. So then why did this type of footwear almost go extinct? Well, there's a million reasons you could point to, from economics to consumer behavior, international relations. Well, number one is just a general rule of economics. More quantity usually means more money, because in the early 1900s, there's a lot more small to medium operations for footwear compared to nowadays, where there's like 5 companies that own 95% of the footwear production, just under different names. So small companies eventually just couldn't compete with that economy of scale that giant companies and giant factories reached over time. Next would be affordability over durability. People used to buy products that lasted a long time because they saw consumer goods as more of an investment. You know, for instance, a toaster would last like 50 years back in the day, where now you're lucky to get 3 or 4 years out of it. And the whole mindset with footwear was completely different, because not many people back then had closets full of boots and shoes. They were more of a long-term purchase. So cheaper and cheaper products slowly became more prevalent as durability and longevity slowly declined. Which leads us to the next thing, which is fast fashion versus investment. It was a similar story, because this concept of fast fashion completely changed the consumer world, especially the last few years. Like, I feel like every 6 months there's brand new trends in footwear that everyone's wearing, and everyone's buying a new pair of shoes every quarter to keep up with the trends. Back in the early 1900s, trends lasted a lot longer, but more importantly, we're in this hyper-consumerism part of our culture right now in our society that has more waste than any part of human history ever. And I'm no exception to the rule. I'm just as wasteful. The footwear market responded accordingly by making cheaper and less durable products, because they knew most people are not even get close to wearing them out, if they even wear them at all. Next is the true handmade versus machine. In the early 1900s, a lot more of the footwear production was a lot more handmade, but certain styles of constructions were a lot more easily adopted by mass production machines like Goodyear welting, versus true moccasin construction is about as complex and handmade as it gets, so it just did not get picked up by mass production nearly as much. Which informs the next point, which is giant corporations versus small brands, because giant corporations have a lot more overhead. They have investors, loans, infrastructure, etc., etc., and they just have an insatiable appetite for more profits for stockholders, since so many of these giant footwear companies are publicly traded and they have to show profits every single year. Versus small companies, they have their own version of their expenses caused by lower quantities and a lot of other variables, but those extra expenses usually are manifested in some degree in making the product better instead of making dividends better for stockholders. And then the last one is your classic story of domestic versus foreign production. And this one's pretty obvious. We've seen it in so many brands that take a reputable brand, they sell it to a giant corporation, and slowly they just strip the entire soul out of the brand by moving production to cheaper countries, using cheaper materials, removing a lot of the handmade aspects. And that's not to say every single product made overseas or that gets shipped to be made overseas is terrible, but it's just a common trend that we see over and over and over, that is an indicator of a brand completely selling out. It's the most unfortunate aspect of this whole story, because it's not the consumers and the people that want these products' fault that they can't afford handmade US goods. It's everything that we went over all rolled into one, but especially that corporate greed, because it's almost single-handedly made this style of construction go extinct. So then how did Russell Moccasin survive this mass extinction event? Well, one of the things was there's really no alternative out there for some of the features that we talked about in this boot that are caused by the style of construction of this boot. They've also done one thing that most companies that fail do not, and that's pivot. They've pivoted over and over and over throughout the history that we went over, but even up into the current era with the new group of owners getting Russell into the digital age by refining the website, virtual sizing, social media. But ultimately, they've continued to make a unique boot that combines Native American moccasins with European boot construction that has a certain feel and benefits that you can only get from this style of boot that can't be matched by modern footwear with modern mass production equipment. And they've maintained the quality that built the brand and maintained the features that made this boot the boot of choice for so many people in so many hobbies and jobs throughout the last 124 years. For those that can afford it, because now in 2024, to get arguably the truest American boot, you have to pay a premium because of what we talked about. And there's still people that see the value in this brand and this product they make. To a point in 2024, in this digital age with iPhones and AI and all the tech, there's still strong value in products like these that live to fight another generation despite all the change that's happened over the last 100 years. All through the lens of the footwear that really made all of that possible, that's so often forgotten and slowly is slipping away to the sands of time. So I really value being able to tell these stories and you guys supporting them. So thank you so much for everything you do. See ya. They couldn't keep up with the new, they couldn't keep up with